Jon, it's absolute pleasure meeting you for the first time, and thank you so much for joining us and giving us up some of your time. Arnold Schwarzenegger was one of the greats and well-known bodybuilders of the era, and he obviously had a mentor and someone that took him under his wing, and that was none other than your father, Reg Park, the legend in bodybuilding, to whom a lot of us also look up to. But besides that, there's another South African that your father took under his wing, and that is Kevin McNamara, probably one of the best natural bodybuilders South Africa ever had or could produce. Maybe you can tell us about Kevin McNamara.
Well, Sean, great pleasure to be with you and meet you as well. And obviously, I've seen all your podcasts, and I think you're doing a great job to continue Kevin's legacy, as he touched many lives. And I'll elaborate on that a little later. But I would like to add to what you said. You know, you mentioned Kevin was probably South Africa's greatest natural bodybuilder. I would like to say that Kevin was probably South Africa's greatest bodybuilder, period. Never mind natural, just period. You know, the amount of titles that he won, and then he, changed direction a little bit, going into the powerlifting world. So a little unusual to be able to, reach a high level in both fields. Yes, to a degree they complement each other, and of course, powerlifting does give you tremendous strength and ultimately will give you muscle mass. But the training for both is quite different, and he was, extremely strong, and he was extremely dedicated. Now, of course, I remember Kevin very well from my days in South Africa, especially from my teens onwards. I saw him win a number of titles, and I visited his gym a number of times. I never trained there, but back in the day, whilst I was still living in South Africa, I was selling posters that I was bringing in from the States of likes of Frank Zane and Boya Coe, etc., Arnold, and I would call on the various gyms, one being Kevin, and they would buy the posters from me. But I remember going there once, and it had a great atmosphere. I remember my dad's original Kirk Street gym, but I was a lot younger then, which had a great atmosphere and that's where Kevin actually started training when he was doing his military service and was based in Johannesburg. He started training in my dad's gym, was probably in the very early 60s. And at that time, that was the gym for anybody who was really serious about bodybuilding to train in, because from what I was told, is that they had, the 18-inch arm club up on the wall, and they had, the 300-pound bench press club, all these various topics on the wall. And so, there were a number of Mr. South Africas that came out of the gym, Mr. Transvaals, etc. So it was the gym, and there was a wonderful atmosphere. And of course, most people trained at the same time. There's like early morning, which is something that my dad started many years ago, because he wanted to get his workouts in before the gym officially opened. So he'd go in very early at 5 in the morning, and then of course that became a popular time. So it was either that or like in the evenings, like 6 o'clock after work, both with the peak times. But the really hardcore guys, most of them were there in the morning. And then, my dad used to have a mail order business, and he used to sell T-shirts, of course, Reg Park T-shirts and sweatsuits, and they'd go through different periods where the white sweatsuits became very, very popular. So all the guys were wearing white sweatsuits, and then it was navy blue. And they all had their Reg Park Health Studio bags and their V-neck Reg Park Health Studio t-shirts. So there was really a wonderful, wonderful camaraderie. Now, I only really saw that on Saturday mornings, which was a treat for me every Saturday morning from a very young age. My dad would take me into town at the Kirk Street gym, and I would witness all these guys working out. And you know, I was like what six years old at the time, 6 to 8 years of age. And Sunday mornings was the same thing, because my dad used to, in those days, mostly because he was passionate about training, used to train on Sunday mornings as well. Sundays was a little bit later. It wasn't 5. It was more like 6, so an hour later, 6, 7. And I remember my dad used to make me stand on the weight stack of the pull down machines, so I'd have extra weight. So I obviously Sundays wasn't as busy, but so I remember that atmosphere, and that was always a great treat to me on a Saturday, because we'd go and I'd go into town, and everybody would go to this deli around the corner. It became very popular, like the whole crew, and you get this mixed group of guys that all got along very, very well. You had the original partners and the owners of the OK Bazar's chain. So we had these, executive, successful businessmen. And then some of the guys were, in those days, bus conductors. So everybody mixed. And some guys came from the elite northern suburbs, and some guys came from, the south. And so there was no sort of barriers between anybody. Everybody got on well, and they'd go to this deli. It was called Plotties. He was, I believe, old Polish man, and they'd all sit and have breakfast together. So the camaraderie was wonderful. The only time I experienced that was in the golden era when I was in high school here, and I was swimming competitively. I would come up here on the weekends and train at the original Gold's Gym. And the same thing this was in the 70s, the mid 70s, and all the guys would go for breakfast together. But when I went to Kevin's gym, I remember seeing that same type of setup. It was, later in the afternoon, around 5-ish, and there was people like Johan de Toy there, and Ray Jordan, and Charles Lotter, who I reconnected with, who was one of Kevin's pupils, very successful bodybuilder. I reconnected with just this year, after many years, through Kevin. Actually, he's living in London, and he had a great relationship with Kevin. So thanks to Kevin, he reconnected us. And frankly, Sean, I'm just thinking aloud. He would probably be somebody very good for you to interview and have on your podcast channel. And you probably may have heard of Charles over the years from Kevin. But Kevin's gym had the same atmosphere, and they're all very serious. And he's talking about, several Mr. South Africas there training at the time. But I never really trained there because I lived in Johannesburg. But I always found Kevin to be, an absolute gentleman. He was always very welcoming and exceptionally polite. And I fondly remember in the early 80s that there was a period of time where Kevin and Johan and Charles and Rake used to, and a number of other guys, I can't recall them all, from Kevin's gym, would come through on a Sunday afternoon to my parents' home. And they would sit on the lawn around the pool. And my dad had these wonderful deck chairs that when he was manufacturing equipment many years ago, he had these deck chairs made, these large deck chairs, and my dad would sit on this deck chair, and they'd all sit on the grass, and they would talk about training. And at that particular time, they were all training, I believe, for the Mr. South Africa. Yeah, it was the Mr. South Africa. my dad would give them pointers and discuss training with them. And this went on for quite a while. It was something I looked forward to, because I always used to sit there and listen. And of course, at that time, in my bedroom, my bedroom walls were like a bodybuilding hall of fame. And I had all these posters and pictures that I'd put up very intricately all over my my bedroom walls. And of course, the guys came in there and they would look at all the pictures and the posters and spend some time in there. And my mother would make tea for everybody. And my mother was a great cook. She was very good at baking, and maybe contrary to the regimented diet of bodybuilders, should make these wonderful cookies and cakes, and of course everybody would indulge. So it was a great atmosphere, and I know that Kevin and my dad formed a relationship for many years, from the early days when Kevin first started training at his Kirk Street gym, and I believe that all the equipment in his gym was originally the Reg Park barbell company that my dad, started making many years ago, which was the standard throughout many of the gyms in South Africa at that time. And then, of course, I came to, and that particular Mr. South Africa, which I went to, it wasn't in Pretoria, but was in the Northern Transvaal. All three won. Kevin won his weight class, Rake won his weight class, and Johan won his weight class. So they're all from Kevin's gym, all Kevin's pupils. I also recall that Johan de Toy and his wife at the time, Leah, used to come also on the Sundays alone, because they were entering in couples bodybuilding, which was big at the time. And my mom, being a former ballet dancer, she helped choreograph their routine. And my dad and me, to an extent, helped them with it, and they ended up winning the South African Championships for couples bodybuilding, for posing. It was very artistic and dramatic. They were way ahead of everybody else, with the likes of my dad and my mother putting the choreography together. So fond memories. And then fast forward many years later, living in America, I went to Tucson, Arizona, where the late Carlos Rodriguez, who owned a gym in Tucson, who was a former Mr. Universe, held the AAU Mr. Universe contest, and my dad was a judge and a guest. And of course, we went there because my mom and dad were here at the time. My dad went there for the weekend and watched Kevin compete in that competition. So that was, I want to say, 87, if I'm not mistaken. But going on from there, I then saw Kevin when my dad passed in 2007, because he came to his memorial service celebration of his life in Johannesburg with Johan at the time, and we reacquainted. And I believe through my mom, I had these posters made of my dad. My mom made sure that he got one. And then when WhatsApp started, it gave us all a chance to communicate with everybody all over the world. And we didn't have to make those, when you think back, those archaic long distance trunk calls, which we used to call them. And you'd always hear an echo on the other side. So once app opened, Kevin and I actually stayed in touch on a regular basis. And I used to have wonderful conversations. And I think Kevin was an enlightened soul, because I know he, first of all, family was paramount to him. And secondly, he cared for people. He had a great care for people. And I saw a lot of similarities between Kevin and my dad, because oftentimes when my dad, after he trained clients, and he was using, a gym in Morningside at the time, he'd sit down with a client afterwards, and they'd have a cup of tea together, and many of them would come around to my parents' home, and they'd come for meals or to have a cup of tea in the afternoon. So it went beyond just the training aspect, and Kevin very much the same. He developed a relationship with all these people who obviously looked up to him, and saw that he was a very caring soul. He was a spiritual man, and there's one particular guy who I'm in contact with. His name's Ian Shield. I believe that you'll be talking to him at some point, and he's filled me in a lot about Kevin over the years. He had an uncle who was actually at school with me, elementary and high school. So we've kept in touch, and I cannot tell you how highly he speaks about Kevin, and how Kevin was such a great mentor to him. And he remembers everything that Kevin had told him, and he'd tell me how he, would often sit down after his workouts and have a cup of tea together, and they'd talk about other topics, music, etc., which you've actually discussed on one of your former podcasts. So there was a time a number of years ago. There's a friend of mine that was actually looking after all my dad's trophies, because when my mom passed, my sister ended up selling. When my dad passed, rather, my sister ended up selling my parents' home, and all the trophies were put into storage, and this friend of mine was looking after them. And I said to my sister, I said, I have a thought. They're just sitting in a box, and they're probably getting tarnished. I said, it'd be wonderful to put them on display, and ultimately, perhaps one day which is my dream here, is to put a gym in my home. But, I'll have them here. But I said, I couldn't think of a better place for them to be on display at Kevin's gym, because, I saw the video of the gym that you had put out, and it reminded me typically of the type of gym that my dad had in the old days. It was an old school gym. Everything was in place, immaculately clean, nothing out of order. And I said, it would be a wonderful place to put them on display if he agrees. And I said to my sister, how do you feel about that? And she says, absolutely. So I asked Kevin, and I said, Kevin, I have these trophies of my dad's. I said, there's a lot of them, and I can't crate them all over here at this stage, and they're just sitting in boxes. I said, but I have a cousin, and my cousin back in the day was very well known, was the owner of Schwartz Jewelers, which was well known in South Africa. Doesn't have the stores anymore, but he's still in the business, and he inherited it from his late father, Ike Schwartz, who was in fact the man who introduced my mom and dad to each other. I said, he's going to clean up all these trophies, and would you be willing to put them on display? And he said it would be an absolute honor and pleasure. And I know they're still there, and he's looked after them with great pride, which you displayed in one of your videos. So I thought that was a much better place to have them on display, because that's part of Kevin's history as well, and at least they'd be seen, as opposed to just packed up in boxes where nobody sees it. So we had a lot of good conversations, Kevin and I, about training, his philosophy of training. Of course, we discussed the current state of bodybuilding, which sadly has morphed into something that most of us from that period of time have no interest whatsoever. But Kevin remained true to his roots and his core, and
Kevin was pretty enlightened. So he, as you very well know, emphasized very high intensity training. Back in the early days, in the 50s and 60s, my dad was a product of that style of training at the time: high volume, high intensity, where they would do multiple sets and multiple exercises. As time went on, I know that my dad started doing less sets, but the late Arthur Jones, who invented the Nautilus principle, of which Mike Mensa was a prodigy of, was a very eccentric character, Arthur Jones, but he was an absolute genius. And when you think about it, his whole principle was 2 sets. You do a warm-up set and 1 set to complete failure. And I started thinking about this more and more in the later years, say in the last perhaps 10 years or so. And there was a period of time a number of years ago, I want to say about 8 years ago, where I started to train very, very seriously again. And I started doing only 3 sets per exercise, and typically just 1 exercise per body part. So I like to say what I did was kind of create a hybrid of what my dad really popularized back in the day in the 50s when he first started. It was the 5x5, which is still a principle used by many all over. And in fact, it was written up in Time magazine the year my dad passed, and mentioned my dad. Very good for putting on size and strength. So of course, 5 sets is certainly not intense as or as enduring, I should rather say, as 20 sets, 25 sets, which they used to do back in the day. And he would do that 3 times a week, a full body, and that's really how he gained his mass in the beginning, and kind of went back to that. So I gave it a lot of thought, and I was thinking, you only have 1 origin and 1 insertion for every single muscle. So to do multiple sets and hit the muscle from multiple angles really doesn't make that much sense, because as time's going on, what you're doing is you're fatiguing the muscle. And the whole goal is to gain a size and strength. So if you're fatiguing the muscle, you're going to reach a point where you are not going to get anything productive out of that type of training. Now, in the old days, you have to understand these guys used to train very, very heavy, and of course they were at multiple sets, because they were mentally disciplined and probably genetically a little bit more gifted than the average person, so to speak. And they used to spend hours in the gym. But Arthur Jones really was onto something, because the other thing that happens is when you train, you depend on glycogen, which is the fuel in the muscle, in order to contract the muscle. But when you start, and the best word to describe it is overtrain, when you start overtraining, you're depleting that glycogen very quickly. And in fact, your glycogen depletes 10% each set. So to do multiple sets, it doesn't make any sense. But also the guys used to eat lots of food. They had high volume of food in those days. And I thought, it's nice to spend time in the gym, but it's better to get in and out as quickly as you can. So what I developed a number of years ago, which I do with all my clients, and in fact with most of my clients, specifically the older clients, I only do 2 sets of every exercise. And I typically only do 1 exercise per body part. Now, I may vary the exercise from workout to workout so they can hit it in a different way, but I normally don't do more than 1 exercise per body part, or should I say 1 compound exercise.
Yes,
So I
yes.
start 3 sets whereby I would do a warm-up set, and then I'll do maximum weight on the second set, and then the third set I would typically take, and I don't really like, although that was the word used, I don't like to use the word failure because I think there's a negative connotation with the word failure. So I like to say limit. So my third set, I'd come down to 80% and push to limit. And that's typically how I've been training. And during that period of time when I started doing this, I put on 15 pounds of muscle in 6 months. So it was obviously impactful, but then I also cycled the training. It wasn't heavy all the time, because that, as you've had in podcast, even with Kevin, it's too much load on the connective tissue on the joints. So I would cycle the training and do a light cycle, medium cycle, heavy cycle for 3 weeks each. Then you come down again. And as Kevin so rightly said, sometimes you need to take a longer break between muscle groups, not just 48 hours, which I agree with 100%. So I sort of did this hybrid of the Nautilus principle and the 5x5 together. And of course, most of the clients that I train, yes, younger guys are a little bit more into it, but they don't have the time to spend 2 hours in the gym, you know. So it's in and out with maximum efficiency. And this is how Kevin trained for many, many years. And I think the first time he was introduced to this was through Mike Mensa when Kevin was visiting California years ago, and he started training using those principles. And you know, Kevin was, as I say, a well-rounded person, and you know, in the end, it makes more sense because it gives you time to do other things too. And I think most people are the product of overtraining, and it's kind of hard to get people to change their minds. They're fixated, and they think that's the only way, but it really isn't. So Kevin was quite way ahead with his thinking in those days. And I like to think my dad was, you know, obviously way ahead in some of the principles that he used, even in those days, and some of the techniques he showed me are only now being showed by all these physiologists on online today. So he was kind of way ahead. But you know, Kevin then, I think, took it to even a further level of just doing. It goes back to the old saying, Sean, less is more. You know. So that worked well for me, and certainly worked very well for Kevin. And I remember back in the day, my dad would sometimes take a 3-week break completely, you know. And I think that's another reason, though, even though he did high volume, why he grew and was able to maintain his muscle mass for a long period of time, because he'd periodically take these breaks as needed. And then he'd also go through cycles where I remember there was a guy who I'm very close to. There's 3 brothers that I grew up with. The oldest one since we were 2, and his mother and my mother were best friends. They were inseparable, and we lived in each other's homes. And the youngest one, who's now a doctor in Los Angeles, went to train with my dad when he was in high school. And he couldn't understand my dad. He was very dedicated and disciplined. My dad would pick him up every morning at 5, and they'd go to the gym, and then he'd get the bus to school. He'd have breakfast in the gym with my dad. He said he couldn't understand it. He said there were like periods of 3 weeks where your dad would train very, very light. And of course, this kid was only like 16, 17 at the time. He says, and I found it very hard to believe that this Mr. Universe is using such light weight. He says, and then after about a 3-week period, boom, he just switched it on and everything started like working a lot heavier. So he was intuitive and in tune, very much like Kevin was with his body. And I think my philosophy today is very much aligned with that, is that when my clients come in, I like them to do a warm-up typically, and I like to teach them how to do the warm-up so they don't necessarily need me around, which is about 15 minutes of active stretching to raise the body temperature and get the circulation going and activate the joints and the muscles. And then once they've done that, it doesn't require any weights. They get into the workout. And it's worked very well for all my clients. As I say, for the most of my clients, it's just 2 sets. And but if you train intensely enough, that's what it's all about. And too many people go into the gym, and this is where Arthur Jones was ahead of his time. And as I say, Mike Mensa was, his biggest proponent of it. Too many people go into the gym and they overtrain, and then it becomes a cardiovascular exercise. And of course, Kevin, with all his pupils, became a proponent of that type of training. You always put your own little twist in, which you find works for you and your clients, and no client is the same. So you have to adapt things and be flexible of mind. And I think that's why Kevin was enlightened, because he wasn't stuck. This is the only way.
Okay.
He was a learned person, and I remember my dad used to say to me, to be successful as a trainer and to be a good trainer, you have to also be a good student. And it was, I had no doubt that Kevin was always experimenting and researching all the time. And I think you have to if you want to grow, because I'm very happy now that I don't have a gym anymore. And if I were to have a gym, it would be very much like Kevin's, with just my own people in there. Because it's very, very distracting. Like my previous gyms, I had other trainers. Now, my initial gym was trainers who just worked for me, so we were all pretty simpatico. Then I opened up a much larger gym, and of course, I had big overheads, so I had to have independent trainers in there that would pay me a fee to use the facility. Some were very good. Some I picked things up from. But for the most part, I see with a lot of trainers, they may be passionate, they may enjoy training, but it's evident to me that many of them are really not educated. And I don't mean scholastically, academically educated. I mean educated in terms of physiology and training. It's a living for them. I'm sure they're sincere about it, but I can tell by the way they train people, giving a lot of these clients secondary movements, which really are meaningful for anybody who hasn't developed a physique. To give somebody who hasn't developed a physique lateral raises or concentration curls, which are isolated movements, makes absolutely no sense to me. So, whoever had the privilege to train with Kevin, had the privilege to train with somebody who was very, very enlightened, and I would say way above most in terms of his philosophy. And of course, he is very technique orientated as well, which they can take with them and pass down to generations, which I see has been done, through my dad. Because I come across people, some of them 70s, 80s who've trained with my dad. Some of them I still have a relationship with. They've never forgotten those principles, and they've handed them down. So, and that's the whole idea of what you're doing now, Kevin, Sean, is you helping continue Kevin's legacy. These are fundamental basics of the training, and this is what it's all about, that they'll be able to take with them. Because as I was talking about, lots of trainers they get polluted with all these different things. Everybody's an expert today. Everybody's online. You know, maybe they've trained a short while and they, want to get their names out there. But if you start following everything that's out there online, you can pollute your mind. You have to pick those and have a discerning eye who are really, masters of the field, people, physiologists, people who've had a lot of experience. And frankly, Sean, there's a lot of bodybuilders out there who I wouldn't trust any of my clients to train with. Yeah, they may have developed physiques. They may have even won big competitions like Mr. Olympia or Mr. Universe. Doesn't mean anything to me, because frankly, from my experience, from what I've seen, is a lot of them don't really know physiology. They certainly knew how to train for themselves to pump up, and of course they trained hard and put a lot, used heavy poundages. A lot of them, through the aids of the chemicals they were taking helped them too. But I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, well, he's won a Mr. Universe or a Mr. Olympia, he's got to be a great trainer. I don't believe that at all. In fact, I'll disagree with that. Unless you find someone like my late dad or somebody like Kevin, who's researched it and made this a study and it made it their life.
Definitely is now, of course. Maybe on something else. So do you think Kevin impacted your life in any way?
Yes, when I would have conversations with him and he'd talk about, the high intensity, and we'd talk about, as I say, the current state of bodybuilding, etc. I try and take something from everybody. I don't think, as I mentioned earlier, you can ever stop learning. And I try and learn a little bit from everybody. If it's something that's worthwhile, I'll keep it, even if it's one thing. So yes, I would have to say, first of all, Kevin was older than me, competed at a high level, international level. He did it all naturally. How can that not impact your life? How can it not inspire you? And also his longevity, But the thing that inspired me most about Kevin was he was just true to his core. He remained who he was, and that's where I see a strong parallel, similarity with he and my dad, is that they were well-rounded. I've seen over the years, especially living here and when I first came here, with a lot of bodybuilders, if you take them out of that environment, sadly, they don't really have anything else in their lives, Whereas with Kevin, my dad, they had their family, they had their circle of friends, their close friends, they had their other interests besides just bodybuilding. And yes, it's great to be focused and have tunnel vision, but I think that with so many of them, once you take them out of that environment, they're kind of a little lost, and I think even socially awkward, because there's nothing else that matters. And I saw this when I first came here with the whole bodybuilding scene, and once the steroids became so prevalent in the sport, I mean, how many years can you carry on competing for, and unfortunately and sadly, you just look back over the last 20 years, how many deaths there's been related to steroids. And in fact, even in the last 2-3 years, I can think of maybe 4 or 5 professionals who passed away, and at a young age. And that doesn't take into consideration all those people out there training who don't even compete, who are taking stuff, who have passed away. We don't know about them. But I last year had a guy call me up. He was referred to me, a young guy in his 30s, and he wanted to know if I would be willing to train him, and I asked him some questions. And I respect the fact he was very open with me. He told me that he takes cycles of steroids and testosterone, etc. And I said, "Are you planning on continuing?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Look, no disrespect, no offense." I said, "I'm not judging whatsoever, but I just wanted to let you know it's not a world I'm familiar with. I don't know enough about it, and I think you would be better served to train with somebody who's more familiar with this world." I said, because I couldn't even advise you on that, because I'm not really interested in it. It's nothing that I even want to participate in. And frankly, Sean, I thought to myself, what happens if I'm training this guy one day and he collapses in the gym and he has a heart attack? It's on me.
I get you.
So when you're training somebody, you have to be on and you have to be responsible. You want them to get results. You don't want to hurt them, or so one has to be very, very clear with their thinking. So Kevin was surrounded, as I said, by his family and by like-minded, wholesome people. He lived a wholesome life, much like my dad did, and that's why I think they were very well-rounded people. Yes,
Interesting.
training.
Yes, of course. Interesting that you mentioned that, because I actually spoke to Kevin's wife, Kathy, and she was telling me that she's seen, because she was also into the bodybuilding with Kevin back in the days, and they noticed how people would spend hours in the gym, and like you say, that's the only thing for them in their life. And she'd seen those people, marriages break up, for instance, and looking at your father, your side, and Kevin, they kept their marriages going.
Yes, and they, as I say, their families were paramount to them. I was fortunate to grow up in that environment. My sister and I, Kevin's kids were fortunate to grow up in that environment. I took it for granted. I thought it was natural, but it was amazing, Sean, after my dad passed, how many of my friends had said to me, they didn't have great relationships with their fathers. My relationship was unique. I remember when my dad passed, this guy came, who I met years ago when I was a kid here, but he was a martial artist, and he was high level. He was a master. I think he was a 7th or 8th dan. I didn't really see much, but he was a nice man. And he came to my office to see me in my gym. He worked up the street, and he sat in my office and cried. He said, if I would have had 1 minute of a relationship with my father that you had, I would have been a very happy man. And this, I was quite actually shocked by this, not just from him, but a number of people, number of friends saying, you had a special relationship with our dad. Our dads were a dad, but nothing like yours. And as I say, I thought it was natural. I took it for granted.
Yes.
So it was a gift. Because my whole goal was to pursue bodybuilding, and that's why I came to America. And my dad said, I was a little naive and probably stubborn, and I was a competitive swimmer, and he wanted me to, continue swimming for a number of years, because he said, you haven't even reached your peak yet. You're young, you've got to wait until you in your mid-20s, you know, even late 20s. And he was right, you know, you can't put an old head on young shoulders, as they say. And I remember when I went to the Olympics, I came 20th overall, which at 19 wasn't bad. But I looked at guys from when I went 1-2 Olympics later, then they were really excelling. So, you know, if I would have continued at 27, I would have really been physically and mentally much more mature, you know. But I was always wanted to emulate my dad and get into bodybuilding. And he said to me, you know, very difficult to do it without steroids. And I said, I disagree. I think if you train hard enough, if you eat smart, and you're intelligent about your eating, you got, you know, decent genetics, I think you can do it. So he didn't discourage me, but he told me, and when I came here and I started training, you know, very hard. I trained with a former Mr. America, Mr. Universe by the name of Bob Paris, and I was making progress. And then my wife was pregnant with our first child at the time, and we were new immigrants here, so we had to go through that whole transition, you know.
Yes, yes.
And I quickly made, because I saw that whole scene which I've been discussing, and I quickly made a decision. I'm not going to subject myself to taking steroids. I don't want to do that, you know. So I didn't pursue it. And that's when I got more and more into training, and I'm glad I didn't. And in fact, even Bob Paris, within a few years, he stopped because he was very open, admitted that he took steroids, but nothing, of course, to the level, even Arnold, nothing, of course, to the level of what they take today. I'm not saying it's acceptable, but it's just gone from, you know, one extreme to a complete different extreme. You know, it's become like, you know, I don't fault the guys who are doing it. If that's what they want to do, fine. It's not necessarily their fault. The powers that be and the judges have created this you know, mutant sport. It's just become all about sensationalism. Yes, they introduced the classic division, which is obviously a lot more appealing, but they were forced into doing that because I think they were losing a lot of interest from the older school generation. But sadly, if they would have not allowed this to go to the extreme it has now, they wouldn't need a classic division. It would have just stayed the same. You know, now there's nothing appealing about open bodybuilding. I mean, I discussed this with Kevin. You know, most of us from that time don't even, you know, pay attention or read the magazines. And I've spoken to the well-known bodybuilders from that era, like who Kevin knew, like Frank Zane and Boya Ko, who are, you know, huge names in the sport. And they have no interest in the sport as it is today, you know. So it's unfortunate, but you know, the whole thing for Kevin, for my dad, for me, is longevity. That's what it's about. Yeah, it's nice to have a nice physique. That's a side effect, you know. And obviously, athletes today, there's not a top athlete in the world today is not doing strength training. If you're not, you get left behind. But it all has to be work. If you want to train for endurance, then you need to train for endurance. But you don't necessarily have to come to the gym to train and do endurance training in the gym. They're two separate entities. I remember the late Arthur Jones was saying, all these people are going for running. He says, all like most of America. So it's a waste of time. You know, they go for these long distance runs. And I remember my dad doing seminars back in the day. Say he used to see all these guys running early in the morning, you know, not many of them not with a great technique. And they'd have this painful look on their faces. He says, looks like purgatory. I remember one guy got up and he got upset. He says, well, what if you like to run? He says, by all means, run. But he said, you know, and he said, but understand why you're doing it. And, you know, guys used to run. Very few of them did any weight training back in the day. So it's all about balance. I think you're going to get much more out of a concise weight training program, which if you train intensely enough, as you well know, Sean, you do get a good cardiovascular benefit anyway when you're handling poundages and you're doing, you know, heavy back work and heavy leg work, two huge muscle groups, you're going to get a cardiovascular benefit. But you know, I think Kevin was spot on, and there's no doubt with the gym continue that it'll continue in that vein, and people will become more educated, and there'll be far less injuries, and it'll be more productive to all these people with their training. So yeah, Kevin was, you know, old school guy with old school principles, and it would be remiss of me to say that it didn't inspire me, but more importantly than from the bodybuilding itself or the powerlifting or strength training, just for the human being that he was. You know, people want to be around people like that. You know, you see, you know, they care. When a guy can sit down after he's trained his clients and have a cup of tea and talk about what you've experienced in your own life, you know, other things in life, that's a well-rounded person. That's a person that you want to be around.
No, of course. Yes, Jon, I think great for sharing this with us. So let's continue this conversation.
Be happy to, Sean, and very nice to meet you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Yes, no, definitely. Well,